Okay, testing, testing. Karen, can you hear me? Angel? Sandy Angel? Okay, can you hear me? No? Okay, can you guys hear me? No? Somebody's done something to this. Okay, what about that? Is that really loud enough? Okay, Karen, can you hear me? Pat? So you guys can hear me? I don't know. This you guys loud enough for you guys? Okay, so I have to start off with a couple of announcements. One, did you guys know in this room we have the same hearing devices? If you have a problem hearing, we have these. They feed directly into the sound system, so they're just in this cabinet right here. If you want one. So that's one. Secondly, somebody asked me this question, so I want to answer it now. And I'll announce it on Sunday, but since somebody asked, I'll answer it. One of the Masses on Sunday, a woman, she hadn't eaten, so she passed out during Mass. So just asked if there's any medical personnel. And so somebody said, well, how should we have handled it? So let me give you my opinion, because it's always right. So this I thought was brilliant. I was at this huge wedding reception, fairly New Year Day, and I was in McCall, and huge wedding reception, and one of the grandmothers of the bride, she falls and breaks her hip. So they tell the mother of the bride, and the mother of the bride, she was amazing, because to be honest, all the men were like business executives, and they didn't know what to do. She took control immediately. And somebody had called an ambulance, so then she says, you're going to cut the cake now, and I want the cake moved over here, and I want everybody's eyes up front. So when the ambulance came, it didn't embarrass the grandmother by being taken out on a stretcher, because nobody noticed, because all the eyes were up front. Does that make sense? And wow, I was like, oh, she is brilliant. And how would you like to be, if I had a heart attack, do not call an ambulance. Drive me to it. But anyhow, really, honest to God, if you passed out because you didn't eat, would you want everybody staring at you? No. So how to handle it? Let's get medical personnel to take care of her, and everybody else, don't look. So it was really sweet. People came over, but the problem is, if you're not medical personnel, you're making it more stressful for the person. So only medical personnel. Does that make sense? And everybody else, pretend like you don't see it. Not because we're cold, because we are compassionate. Does that make sense? So somebody asked, so there you go. There's my opinion. Also remember, for these Exploring Catholicism classes, we have these little save the dates, but have to admit it's wrong, because I'm going to be going on vacation, usually take in November, but I'm going to be on vacation, so next week I won't be here. So next week, I talked Deacon Chris and Mary to do Ignatius spirituality on the exercises. There's a lot there, so that's next week. So this sounds kind of strange. It's a little out of sequence. So we did, what did we do last week? Celtic. So that's 5 to 700s in Ireland. Now we're going to jump down to Italy, the 1200s, and then we're going to jump to the 16th century, 17th century to Ignatian spirituality. And then when I get back, we're going to spend 2 weeks in the 14th century. In the Rhineland mystics, that's Germany, and then the other class will be the English mystics. Because they're both kind of different. And like many of you, my favorite century of mystics is the 14th century. So I'll spend a lot of time there. Also, there's some pamphlets on the secular Franciscans. So there's a secular Franciscan group, so that's Third Order Franciscans. They're back in the table. I'll give you that because you look like you need it. Then let's see. There's one more announcement I forget, but I want to. Oh, yes, I remember. I spent a lot of time making these keto quiches because I'm most at home in the kitchen. That's where I like to spend most of my time. Okay, that's what we call a makey-uppy. You guys know I hate cooking, right? Oh, you didn't know that? Oh, I hate cooking. Oh, my God, it's terrible. And then you have to eat what you cook, and what I cook always tastes like dog food. So, sorry, I don't like cooking. Now, people have eaten my food and gone on to live fairly normal lives. But I'm just raising this because, we do have a lot of people who contribute, but it's always kind of the same people. So what I want is just a little bit more help. So we have little tiny water bottles, so it's not always the same volunteers. We have little tiny water bottles back there. Not water bottles, cleaning. So at your table, if you could just spray it down, and there's some towels back there. So why don't we just all pitch in when it's done and spray down your own table? Make sense? Okay, so with that, oh, shoot. With that, I meant to print off the prayer of St. Francis, but I forgot to do that. So let's just start in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. So, actually, before I get to St. Francis, I forgot to mention this last week about Celtic spirituality, so I want to return back to it because I love this part of Celtic spirituality. Celtic spirituality, remember, was monastic. And if you go to a monastery, like my seminary was in a Benedictine monastery, and if you go there, everybody gets a spiritual director. Like, you have to choose a spiritual director. And you meet with your spiritual director once a month. So this sounds kind of strange. In Ireland, they promoted what's in Gaelic called the Anam Cara. And an Anam Cara is, you pray for, Anam Cara means soul friend. Not a best friend, not a good friend, no offense, not a drinking buddy. You pray for an Anam Cara. And then let's say I ask you to be my Anam Cara. You take a vow before God that whatever I tell you, you must keep the secret. But, so you're my Anam Cara for a year, and I just meet with you once a month. And the Irish did it really weird. It wasn't until 1412 that Catholics can go to confession once in a lifetime. So most Catholics never went to confession every week or month. The Irish changed it, where, and this sounds kind of strange, over 2,000 years we've done confession in all sorts of different ways. So what you would do is you would go to your Anam Cara, and I would give my confession to you. Then the Anam Cara would give me a penance, and then I would go to the priest for absolution. And the priest would say, did you confess to your Anam Cara? Isn't that a bizarre way of working it? So anyhow, the Irish are the ones who started going to confession more than once in a lifetime. There was a big fight. The Irish won, as usual. But the church changed, says, yeah, but you have to give your confession not to your Anam Cara, but to the priest. But anyhow, like I do think it's wise, if you want a Celtic spirituality, that everybody have an Anam Cara. Somebody who's not a best friend, a soul friend, that you can kind of share your spiritual journey with. The other thing, do you remember in Celtic spirituality they had common prayers that the whole community would say together at, not in one spot, but when you're doing certain activities, like lighting a candle or seeing a sunrise or certain activities, certain times, no matter where you were, you just stopped and everybody did it, right? So then after class, somebody suggested, well, why don't we do that as a parish? And so what I'm going to create is, and it'll take me some time because I'm very slow, maybe during Christ the King, come out with like prayer cards with the Shema on it. The Shema is this prayer to love with all your heart, mind, and soul. But and have everybody pray it at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, if you want. And the prayer is that our parish becomes a place of love and unity. Does that make sense? The same way the Celts were united, why don't we pray that we be united? And do that from Christ the King through Advent. So, anyhow. And then, let's see. So, jumping ahead, going down south to Italy, I'm going to talk about the mendicant orders. So, this sounds kind of strange, but this is the century that the mendicant orders arose, and cities started to expand. And then universities came into their own. So, mendicant is just a big fancy word for beggar. Mendicant orders were in once this response to what was needed in the church. Now, this is going to be my theme. Hopefully you'll pick it up. That the spirituality that Christ blesses in every century and place is the spirituality that is the antidote to what's poisoning society. And mendicant orders is what the church needed. It needed a spirit of poverty. It needed preaching. So St. Dominic and St. Francis, what they did is put monasteries on wheels. Instead of monasteries being off in secluded areas, they put it on wheels and brought it into the city. And in a way, they returned Christianity back to its founders. Christ said, go out and preach and bring only what's necessary. That's exactly what the mendicant orders did. So in the state of the world, external to the church, there was this growth of cities that also helped spread the plague and numerous urban poor. But internally in the church, monasteries became inadequate to meet the pastoral needs. And the local clergy were morally and intellectually kind of incompetent. The church at this time period became choked with the quest for power and wealth and even violence. Now the amazing part is you had St. Francis on this side, and the opposite St. Francis would have been Pope Innocent III. Who Pope Innocent III, he was our most brilliant and intellectual pope. Like he was really just a genius and gifted. He was elected at age 37. He was a shrewd lawyer, born to be a ruler. He was a turning point in medieval popes. But here's the only problem. As gifted as he was, and he truly was, there's one small problem with him. He was enormously corrupt. Just a small problem. But like he was prejudiced. He forced all Jews to wear special clothing so he knew who they were. They had to pay special taxes. He made the papacy about absolute power, so everything is orientated to the Pope. And if you were Innocent III, anybody who came to see Innocent, you had to bring a gift, and it had to be a pretty nice gift. So he used the papacy to heighten his power, that papacy to become enormously wealthy. And he changed the title. Remember, the title of the Pope was Vicar of Peter and Paul to Vicar of Christ. And if you notice, the problem with saying Vicar of Christ is like John Paul II did away with that. And you say, why did John Paul II do away with the title Vicar of Christ? He said, because by our baptism, aren't we all vicars of Christ? Aren't we all representatives of Christ? Does that make sense? So it's John Paul II that flipped kind of pulls away from Innocent III. But Innocent III, um, he really changed the papacy for money and power. And for power, like this sounds kind of strange, Innocent III, I'm not saying he ordered them, but it is kind of shocking. The same time he takes the papacy, there's suddenly all these forgeries of ancient documents. They're not ancient, they're just forgeries, that speak more and more about the power of the Pope. Pseudo Isidora was one. The donation of Constantine, if you ever heard of that. Anybody hear of that? Oh. The donation of Constantine, it was this will that was suddenly discovered from Constantine. Remember, Constantine had been dead for almost 1,000 years. But suddenly they found this ancient will that Constantine willed all his land to the Pope. But they knew it was a forgery. But so the papacy under him became more monarchical than spiritual. And he was brilliant, but he did, and this is a good thing, collect all these laws and rules and how to govern canon law, promulgated more laws than anybody else, but also a lot of forgeries. But he also militarized the church. So this was called a time of sacred violence because the church was inspired and legitimized the use of violence to expand the church against pagans, against heretics, even against fellow Catholics. So Innocent III, he actually blessed certain sides of a war. The rape and sacking of Constantine, the Fourth Crusade, this war against the Albigensians, really bestial cruelty and trying to wipe people out. I'll get into what that was in a second. But, it begins to question where the man who died for others and preached love and forgiveness would have really approved Innocent III's actions. Not only did he have violence, but he kind of increased the clericalization of the church. Under Innocent III, clerics now were set above the laity. Now, granted, that's the way it should be, but suddenly now priests are above the laity, not serving the laity. Like a mini little pope. Each priest is a mini pope. Does that make any sense? So I will say this. Like the priesthood in my lifetime has changed completely. It's amazed. It goes from adoration to suspicious. I mean, the moment, like I was at the gym and somebody said, "What do you do for a living?" And I said, "I'm a Catholic priest." And he says, "Oh." And he says, "Really?" And I said, "These days, do you really think anybody would try and pass themselves?" And this older priest, who I think is really funny, he's a retired older priest, and he says, "At one time we were gods." Like, I think about that because, and I'm quite happy, don't get me wrong, but, priests, generation, but they didn't do their own laundry or do their own cooking. So anyhow, there's this clericalization, and here's the most important part. He really ramped up the appointment of bishops by the Pope alone. And that might shock you, but canonically, how are bishops and priests appointed? This is going to shock you, but I don't know if you know this. Canonically, the local church elects their bishops. Did you guys know that? So yeah, like the bishop's ordination, they'll say, it's right there. They'll say election. Do you accept him as your bishop? And everybody applauds. Well, there's only one candidate. But actually, if you study Catholic history, it was and is supposed to be the local Catholics who elect their bishop. Innocent III, he's about power. He's the one who really pushed that, no, it's got to be appointed from the Pope. It can be appointed from the Pope when there's nobody else, when there's not a community. Like, nobody elected St. Patrick, right? Because there wasn't a Irish community. Does that make any sense? So but technically it's a local community. So he controls that. Just saying what the century did. And this is the culture that Francis would have grew up in before his conversion. This typified the dominant spirituality at the time. After his conversion, his spirituality was to reject power, glory, and status. His rejection is not a rejection of the church, because that's Protestantism. His rejection of it was for power, glory, and self and status. This is a new way, unlike kind of the anger reaction. Francis wanted to convert the church. Actually, he just wanted to convert himself. But this is also the time period of heretics and nonconformists. So there was, at Francis' time period, this organized resistance formed against the excesses of power and wealth and the palatial attitude of senior clergy. And this is going to be the shocking part. I'll get to this in a second. Priests stopped preaching. Isn't that bizarre? You know, it's a lot of work to preach. So they simply stopped. Isn't that just amazing? So in the absence of priests actually evangelizing or teaching or preaching, all these heresies developed. And oddly enough, the clergy was more concerned about power and wealth than actually teaching and preaching. And so there's other movements that started by the slogans of quote-unquote lay preaching or gospel poverty. Francis wasn't the first. But here's the difference. They wanted to reject the church. Francis wanted to change the church. Huge difference. Like the Albigensians or the Carthusians, that means pure in Greek, they abstained because the church hierarchy in Innocent III was all about power and wealth. They made vows against wealth, military service, and actually were vegetarians. That's the Albigensians. But the problem is, they said, all matter is evil, and even marriage should not be allowed. Well, it would have died out if they just would have let it for obvious reasons. But that's actually against Catholic teaching. We don't say matter is evil. Well, you know, God is in creation. But the odd part, their rejection of the excesses of Innocent III, their heresy, though, it did demand great physical austerity from its followers, but it undercut Catholic teaching about the goodness of the world. There's also another one, Waldo. It's not, where is Waldo? Waldo was this very rich merchant from Lyon who became fabulously wealthy, realizes wealth was killing the Catholic Church. So actually he's kind of converted by the Sermon on the Mount, and he starts lay preaching. He's just a businessman, but the priests aren't preaching, the bishops aren't preaching, so he starts preaching. Now, some of the stuff what he was preaching was very, for somebody who had a lot of wealth, preaching against wealth. So bishops got upset with his extremism and preaching, and some of their thoughts were really off the mark and very quite harsh. And so the Pope had them tortured. But that only drove it underground. Does that make any sense? That didn't do away with it. And so papal legates made it illegal to torture heretics. Now, this is going to change Francis and Dominic, especially Dominic. Because Dominic, and I'll get into this at the end, said, well, you know, why don't you start preaching? Rather than torture them, why don't you show Catholics a better way? Why don't you preach and get rid of all your love of wealth? That's how the Dominicans start. Or that's how I was saying, Dominic started. Francis, kind of the same thing. Francis, it's the 12th century. He's a son of a very wealthy, cloth merchant. He is attracted to the frivolous and the material. He had a very privileged life, and what he dreamed of was glory. Now, just a little background. First, he dreamed of glory. He thought he'd become a knight, but he was captured in war. So I don't want to get too much into this because I'll lose you, but Remember, you had the upper class and the lower class. But the rise of the city, and especially the Crusades, opened up roadways. So suddenly you have a lot more trade. So this middle class developed, merchants, who, especially with road opening up and exchanges, the middle class could become incredibly wealthy. That's where Francis' father was. And Francis' father became incredibly wealthy, but they weren't aristocracy. Does that make sense? They had wealth, but they didn't have aristocracy. And so Francis, he grew up quite wealthy, but not an aristocrat. So he dreamed of becoming a knight so that he might become part of the aristocracy. And Assisi went to war against, I think it's Pergama? No, starts with a P, a neighboring town. But they were all noble class, and Francis and the Assisi were the aristocracy. So he goes to war, but he's captured and he spends a year in prison, which for a very privileged elitist was difficult. And there he got sick, but his father did ransom him. But this experience of being a prisoner provoked kind of the spiritual crisis for him. And he was always a very fastidious person and had this abhorrence towards the poor and the sick. And after that, it kind of cracked his heart. And one day when he was riding in the countryside, he saw a leper and then shared his cloak with the leper. And he was moved to kiss the poor man. And from that encounter, Francis' life began to take on a different shape. It contrasted the values of his time period. Like, there was this group of wealthy in his town, wealthy young men who were just partiers. And it was more like a fraternity. He was their president. He led it. And so suddenly now he's confronted with values that are the opposite of his culture and his family. And while visiting Rome, he gave money to the poor and then decided, this is bizarre, to spend a day living with the poor. And it filled him with immense joy. More than caring for the poor gave him more joy than his luxury. So when he's back in Assisi, he's praying at this chapel of the San Damiano, in front of the San Damiano crucifix. Now, sorry, I got to change this. If you're wondering what the San Damiano crucifix is, it's back there in the oh, here it is. It's this one. It's kind of famous. There's different ones. That's the San Damiano crucifix. And he's praying in front of the crucifix, and it spoke to him. And he heard this voice, Francis, repair my church, which has fallen into ruin. Now, when it does that, he thinks it's, he's thinking the actual physical church. Does that make sense? So he starts to collect stones and spend really his father's money for repair. But on the feast of St. Matthias, once again, he hears, repair my church. And granted, at first took it literally, and only later did he understand the call was to return to the simplicity of the gospel, the spirit of the poor, finding Christ in the least. And his father finds out he spent all this money on repairing church. Actually, there's 3 churches, but demands the money back. And he takes him to court. And in this extraordinary scene, Francis strips off even his clothes and gives it back to his father. And the bishop, and this sounds kind of strange, we're coming out of the Dark Ages, the bishop would have presided, puts his own cloak around Francis and asks for a beggar's cloak he's not going to keep it, to be put on Francis. Well, that begins Francis's beginning as a beggar. Now, this sounds kind of strange. Everybody, who wouldn't love St. Francis, right? To be honest, the people of Assisi did not like St. Francis at first. You gave up all that money, and this is one of my favorite of all. This is Giotto's picture. Francis could, preach to the birds, which, true story. Uh, who wouldn't want a holy man like that? The people of Assisi thought he was crazy at first. You're choosing to become a beggar after all that wealth? And so they used to throw rocks at St. Francis when he'd come by. Or he was begging for food, and he went to this house of one of his wealthy friends who were there having a party. And when he sees it's them at the door, he turns around and walks away. But then he realizes, once again, that's pride. So he turns back and asks for food. So it's this bizarre thing. And then, like, Francis was hoping to marry a woman of the upper class so he could finally get a title. But now Francis, and I'm going to talk about this again, he talk about that he is married to Lady Poverty. So he's taken vows. Now, eventually, he gets 12 followers. And he gets his marching orders from Mary of the Angels, but for 3 years lived in utter destitute. Anybody go to Assisi and see Mary of the Angels? Isn't that amazing? It stunned me. Because you go to this huge cathedral, right? On the outside, it's a huge cathedral. And then when you walk inside is a little, and I forget what they call it, the portico? Is that what they call it? Yeah, something like that. I don't speak Italian. Inside this huge church is the little tiny church they started out on. And I don't know why, I just absolutely loved it. And so I went in and prayed a rosary because everybody was praying a rosary. And so I joined in the rosary. But everybody was praying the rosary in their own language with the same cadence. It was actually kind of neat to hear all these languages in this little tiny hut inside a larger one. And yet it was just a great event. But it was Mary of the Angels, and then later, as you know, St. Clare joined with the other quote-unquote poor ladies. St. Clare was of the upper class as well. So that would have been shocking. And so he starts this, and I'm trying to edit this down. But Innocent III allowed Francis to start his order because Innocent III had a dream the night before he met with Francis. And in the dream, John Lateran, the main church, was falling. And he sees this little man hoisted up, the sinking church. And so the Pope approved Francis's order. So what did Francis order? What's a Franciscan spirituality? What do they offer the world? Well, remember, the first is going to be poverty. That sounds strange, but that's a gift. Remember, a merchant class were open up. There was a rise of the money. There was money before that. But now with mercantilism, there's a lot more. What I think, what a Franciscan spirituality, not really big on mine. I would say maybe 2% of my spirituality is Franciscan, not much. But I think that's a real gift, is poverty, or at least simplicity, that Francis offers us, because I was shocked the first time as a missionary went and saw what real poverty looks like. You won't find it in the United States, or it'd be very hard. We're hundreds of people, families, living in a garbage dump with nothing. That's poverty. And the United States, we're so consumed by wealth. We live better than 99.9% of all human beings in history. We live better than most people in the world. Like, you wouldn't want to be, if you were like a multimillionaire in the 18th century, you live better now than the wealthiest person in the 18th century. We live very, very well, and yet all you hear people complain is that they don't have enough. And even like, I'm disgusted, but I taught a class on the Dark Ages in Bishop Kelly High School, which I'm a big supporter of Bishop Kelly High School, but I was talking about the Dark Ages, and I asked the kids, I said, well, what would you do if everything in the United States was ruined? Legal system, banking, everything. How would you rebuild society? And all of them said, well, we'd attack another country. And I said, well, they wouldn't have anything either. And he said, well, we'd just build up an army. And I said, where would you get the metal? Do you know how hard it is to dig and work in mines? And they said, well, we'll just get it. And I said, well, wait a minute. You said, that just doesn't happen. I said, you have to rebuild everything. I said, how many people here, raise your hand, how many people here have ever dug a ditch? No, well, I don't mean you people. I meant the high schoolers. None of them. I said, how many of you guys even have a job? None of them. None of them have ever dug a ditch, and yet they have cars. All of them had cars. Like, my only point being is that they just don't understand. Part of our society is just, we're choking on, just like Francis' time, of too much wealth. And at the time period, this sounds kind of strange. Remember, you had the upper class and the lower class, and suddenly this merchant class. But what society had was called oaths of fidelity. So if you're of the lower class, you would, quote unquote, bend the knee, and let's say Ed is my lord. I would bend the knee and take an oath of fidelity. So he's going to protect me, but I owe him everything. So if I want security, because I'm poor, I have to take an oath of fidelity to somebody wealthier, and he'll protect my family. But I'm at his service. So a common way of greeting somebody would be if I said, who do you belong to? And if you ask me, who do I belong to, I'd say Ed. So I give up my freedom for security. Does that make sense? That's how the world worked. But now Francis does something different. He doesn't bend the knee to anybody but Christ. He's willing to live in insecurity, powerlessness. So Francis goes through life making no oath, bending no knee to anybody but Jesus. No security, and yet is completely free. And so like at that time period, you had the upper class was really in Latin called the firm, and they could carry a sword. So you had firm and inferior. The inferior is a lower class. And the lower class, they must be dependent upon the firm. And the lower class, the inferiors, they're not even allowed to carry a weapon. Francis chose to be exposed and vulnerable. Francis is the countercultural of the culture of security and wealth and power. That's the spirituality I want. So Francis was completely, when I say poverty, I just don't mean your bank account. I mean being completely vulnerable, and that's your freedom. And so in Latin, it's sin proprio, which Francis is. It's not really poverty, it's sin proprio. It's a life with absolutely no possessions for the individual. It's all for the community. And so while Rome is seeking money and buildings and privilege, Francis' way was, sin proprio is more, it's not having, but like if I had a house, which I really don't, but if I had a house, if I had Francis' philosophy is, Lois, you need to borrow the house, have a house. You want my car, it's my car, but it's everybody's car. Does that make any sense? You get your hands off my car. In fact, like, I was going to do this and then I'll do it now. But like, just think how wild that is. Now, I know this priest who, to me, he's the image of sin proprio, of St. Francis. He's not a Franciscan, he's Dawson, but he's crazy. And his name is Bruno. He's Italian. Like, not Italian, but like real Italian. And he's crazy. And I met him when I was a seminarian, and he was traveling through Idaho. And he was traveling through Idaho, and just a delight, joyful, blah, blah, blah. And I was with this nun, and he said, oh, yeah, I'm just traveling. And the nun says, Bruno, where's your luggage? And Bruno says, who needs luggage? He says, I run out of clothes, I go to a thrift store. If I need underwear, I go to Kmart. But that is him, and he is joyful. And, like, I shouldn't tell you this. Hopefully nobody hears this. But, like, so now Bruno's 80 years old, but if you met him, he has a vitality of a 30-year-old. But the bishop forced him to retire, but does have some retirement, but he's kind of given everything away, so he doesn't really have anything. And so he stays at St. Mary's basement not the basement. The priest there, John, who's German and ex-military, very tightly wound. Bruno can stay at his place in the basement, but John and Bruno, they're good friends, but couldn't be more opposite, because John says, I love Bruno, but he drives me up the wall, because that's downtown Boise. And he says, if there's not a parking in the neighborhood, Bruno will just drive the car up on the lawn and park it on the lawn. Of course, John's German. You don't do that. Or Bruno, this is kind of funny, he goes through his trucks and cars because he really is this Franciscan sin proprio, where you need a car, Lois, here. No, give me $1, I'll give it to you. I'll let you. He's gone through several. And once he had this little truck, and he keeps the keys in the truck unlocked, and somebody stole the car. So John, of course, gets upset and says, well, you got to call the police. And Bruno was like, well, maybe the person needed a car. I don't know. Why are you worried about it? Bruno has complete insecurity, no money, steal his car. He's just as happy. Does that make sense? He never feels like he has anything but his clothes on his back and his underwear, literally. And so he retired, and he's 80-some years old, but doesn't quite have enough to live on his own. So he got a job. Bishop forced him to retire. He lives in John's basement, and he works at a drive-in restaurant, just making fries. And he is joyful and happy. You know what I mean? Think about this. Marge, how old are you? 50? 55? What if you were retired, but you didn't have enough to even make your bills? And you had to work at a drive-in making French fries. Most people, especially when you reach 80, would find that an indignity. Bruno, he's in love with. Do you know how many people he gets to talk to per day? And I had a friend who went to the drive-in and said, there's a priest making, and he says, he's in love with all these people. How are you doing? Does that make any sense? Talk about sin proprio, where I don't have anything, I don't need anything, I'm completely insecure financially, power-wise, and completely free. That's my image of St. Francis. Does that make sense? So St. Francis, it's not just poverty. It's not about poverty. It's completely being free of all of it. So Francis didn't ask his brothers to beg. He actually ordered them to work for their bread, and only if they didn't have enough to beg. So just this sounds kind of strange. Think how that's changed St. Francis. He was a deacon, but at Christmas time, it was an ancient practice to go to Jerusalem during Lent, but also sometimes at Christmas later. And so Francis, he's with the poor. Well, you're not going to be able to we can't go to Bethlehem. So Francis is the one who thought, well, then we'll bring Bethlehem to us. And he's the one who thought of making a creche. What the creche highlights is that Christ, God, can come and isn't born among kings, is born so poor that a homeless poor couple. Does that make sense? So Francis elevates poverty as a great virtue. That if Christ can handle poverty, why can't you? And so I think of Father Bruno thinking, well, I'm always, if they do away with Social Security, I'm in trouble. I just hope at 80 I could be happy working in I would love to be as free as Bruno, being, I don't know, I'll clean toilets at 80, and think of all the people I get to meet. You know what I mean? He highlights Christmas as a season of Christmas. God takes on human flesh and doesn't need power or wealth or any of that stuff. Same things with Stations of the Cross. It was Francis who did that, highlighting that, oh no, to be a follower of Christ, you die to all that. So one, just like that idea of poverty, I think the church and society really does need a Franciscan spirituality. Secondly, humility versus pride. Think of Pope Innocent III, who you had to show up bearing some gold because it was all about his privilege and honor. He put clericalism on steroids. Francis goes the other way. Francis highlights humility. You can't see that, so put that back. The Franciscan symbol is, this is called a tau cross. That's actually a Greek letter. The tau is a Greek letter, and in Greek, every Greek letter symbolizes a virtue. The tau symbolizes humility. So it comes up in Scripture in two places, Book of Daniel and Book of Revelation. All those in heaven have the tau on their forehead. So when anybody is baptized, the first thing we give them is a tau on their forehead. And it says that God's name is written on your forehead. God's name is humility. Everybody in heaven, the only way to get into heaven is practice humility. It is written on your forehead. So Francis, he loves that idea of humility. So he takes the tau. If you ever see somebody wearing this cross, it's a tau cross. It means they're a Franciscan. That we're the ones who are going to restore humility back to the back among earth. Not pride and more arrogance. So he practiced mortification. And humility is to trust in all situations, this basic joy that stays and sustains people despite rejection or deprivation. This is a call to the church to reform itself, because bishops and popes are choking on power and privilege. But his spouse is Lady Poverty. He simply trusts that God will provide. Humility was great joy. So that's the tau cross. I don't know if I have another one, but I don't think it shows up. Oh, this is a tau cross that just has the picture of St. Francis on it. But also, just another thing about his spirituality, remember he was married to Lady Poverty? Well, Francis lived at the time of the troubadours, which actually is French. So the name Francis means little Frenchman. And the reason why he's named that, even though he's Italian, is that France was the big power at the time. And his father wanted to make Francis have connections to power. And what was really popular in French society was a troubadour. That I fall in love with you and I sing you poetry. So, believe it or not, that's part of Francis' spirituality, is to be a troubadour, a poet, a singer, a lover. And so this, and I'll get into this again and again, is called, quote-unquote, betrothal spirituality. Betrothal spirituality is you're married to God. Your life is supposed to be this love affair between us and Christ. And liturgically, baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, I'm not going to get into this, it's a wedding. If you look at the Bible and wedding ceremonies, every time you celebrate the Eucharist, that's renewing your wedding vows. Your life is supposed to be this love affair with Christ. So Francis literally would sing. Like the Canticle of Creation, it was a song as well as a poem. And like my theology, I have to admit, is a little bit more servant theology, about duty. Servant means I have a duty. Franciscan spirituality is, my life is a love affair. Think of Bruno. You know, Bruno is this priest. He's happy even with nothing. He's a lover. Does that make any sense? So I'm not going to go into it, but have you ever thought, like this priest said this once when I was in high school, where he was crazy. But during communion, there's a popular song, Dan Fogelby's I've Loved You with an Ancient Love. And he said, oh yeah, we're going to play that during communion. He says, when you hear that, imagine it's Christ saying, I have loved you with an ancient love. And I remember at the time thinking, That's bizarre. Because my idea was religion was moral rules, not a love affair. Does that make sense? But after that, I was so moved by that. When I'd hear a popular love song on the radio, I'd still, to this day, imagine it's Christ singing to me. This Christ wants a love affair with us. That's a big part of Franciscan spirituality. Think about the opposite of this, is Innocent III, that anybody who was a heretic, and the heretics, they had right to rebel against the church excesses, but he throws violence at them because they're not following the rules. He doesn't throw a love affair at them. Francis' way of dealing with heresy is by calling people to a greater love. That's betrothal spirituality. The fourth is, Francis is also a peacemaker. I wanted that one for peacemaker. So Francis served in the military and, of course, was in prison. But later, in one sense, the Franciscans are crusaders for peace. The Pope advocated a crusade against fellow Catholics, against other people. And think about this. When Francis went to war the first time, he would have been outfitted in this, it was actually reported, this splendid outfit that his father could afford. And yet it failed in misery. And when he's in prison, he has this dream where he's in this mansion, has all these shields, which means, the upper class. And God says to him, why do you serve the servant rather than the master? That was his first vision where he was called to something. People serve politics or the servant of war rather than the master of peace. So Francis starts this new crusade, not for violence, but for peace. I love his prayer, make me an instrument of your peace. So there's a story that Francis goes to the Sultan, the other one's the Sultan, to make peace. And to go to the Sultan, you could be executed. So they grant him an audience, but to get to the Sultan, I love this, they laid out crosses all in front of the Sultan. And so Francis walks on the crosses to the Sultan and said, you're a liar. You desecrated the cross. That's a Christian symbol. And Francis said, no, there are 3 crosses in the story. I stepped on the other 2. Which I think is just so funny. Anyhow, him and the Sultan become good friends. But the Sultan says, I can't convert because... sorry, I missed part of it. Francis, you'll notice the fire in the background in that icon. Why the fire? Because Francis preaches to the Sultan, says, I'll prove that the gospel is true. Build 2 fires, and I'll walk on one and have your people walk on the other. And the imams, the imams refused to, but Francis is willing. And that's when the Sultan told Francis that he does believe in the gospel, but if he converted, his subjects would turn against him. He can't do that. So Francis says, well, before you die, I will send 2 of my brothers to you so that you can be converted before you die. And the Sultan gives him his ring so that the Franciscans could go anywhere in the Middle East. That's why if you look at all the holy sites, the reason why the Franciscans are often in charge is because they had an exemption from the Sultan. And before the Sultan died, Francis did appear to 2 of his followers, told them to go, and supposedly he was baptized just before he died. The other story of reconciliation is between the bishop and mayor of his town. Both of them were in this huge fight, and it was dividing the town. And remember the Canticle of Creation, brother, sun, sister, moon? The part that was ending was, in pardoning, we are pardoned, and in dying, we're... So Francis, when the bishop and the mayor are refusing to reconcile, that's when Francis adds one about pardoning. And he sends the friars to sing the canticle with the new addition about pardoning, we are pardoned. And actually, the mayor breaks down first, and then the bishop. But the shocking part is, after 20 years of Francis promoting peace and reconciliation, still in his hometown, they can still be fighting. But I love that he's saying the fractions into peace. So in an age of sacred violence, Francis espoused this radical rejection of all forms of violence to nonviolence. Any act of violence, he thought, was a desecration against the gospel of love. And so Francis, like a Franciscan way of saying would be peace and good. You always hear peace and good, but Francis would greet people with the word peace. Now, granted, that is actually in the Bible as well, but at the time period, people thought that was weird, that Francis would always greet people with peace. And Pope Francis, on the anniversary of Vatican II, I'm going to repeat something he said, talks about St. Francis wanting all people united. And he says, how many times in the wake, this is Pope Francis, how many times in the wake of the council did Christians prefer to choose sides in the church, not realizing that they were breaking their mother's heart, to be on the right or the left rather than with Jesus, to present themselves as guardians of the truth or quote-unquote pioneers of innovation, rather than seeing themselves as humble, grateful brothers and sisters of Holy Mother Church. Let us overcome all polarization and preserve our communion with each other. So I just mentioned that because Francis was the way of peace, a peacemaker. And I just think there's too much division in the church. We could use a little Franciscan spirituality in the church today. The other thing, the fifth thing, is Francis' way of the cross. Think about it. Francis promotes the way of the cross. Literally, why we have him on our church walls is because of Francis. What Innocent III wanted to promote was the way of power. I won that one. Innocent wanted to promote the way of power, but Francis promotes the way of the cross. And, of course, everybody knows Francis is one of the several saints that had the stigmata. This is an image of him getting the stigmata. The way of holiness is not the way of power and safety and privilege. It's the way of the cross. And Francis, he sees a seraphim. And once again you ask, what's a seraphim? Remember, there's tetramorphs, seraphims, and angels. Seraphims are creatures of fire, pure fire, with 6 wings of fire. Except he sees this seraphim, but then he says he sees the body of Christ on the seraphim. Usually, you never get to see a face of a seraphim. But there's the image of Christ, and he said he sees it, and it gives him the stigmata, the wound in the side, the hands and the feet. Now, he was embarrassed, and he actually tried to hide it. And he did live with excruciating pain that it caused him, but the stigmata was a sign of his closeness with Christ. But it fits because he rejected the way of luxury and clerical excesses. That one has to embrace suffering to attain perfect joy. So I love that. And of course, the other part about Francis I love is, I think we need, is his love of creation. Everybody has Francis with the animals. Like, there is a story, after his breakup with his father, he never used the word father except to refer to God. But you have all these stories where he preaches to the birds. There's a story about this wolf that was attacking a town. So you'll see sometimes him with a wolf, where he talks to the wolf not to attack people. In Praise of the Created World, shows the glory of God. Brother, sun, sister, moon. Franciscans call themselves, quote unquote, servants of creation. Oddly enough, he never wanted to be canonized. Of course he is. And I guess the last point, because I need to wrap it up, is I like the seraphim one, the burning image again, for the reason that Francis brings passion back to Christianity. There was this priest named Sylvester, Father Sylvester, who he was known to be very concerned about power and wealth And he sees Francis and the other Franciscans, and their zeal converts him. So he was known to be this greedy-old priest who then becomes a Franciscan himself. Francis walks into a church of ruin before his conversion and didn't notice the church was falling down. After his conversion, he notices the church needs to be rebuilt. Except it's only when Christ speaks from the cross that he notices it needs to repair, but the real repair was not the physical building, but, as I said, the wealth and the power that was destroying the church. And Francis created this passion, or his passion for Christ reignited the church. I just think that's absolutely amazing. Now, I'm not going to get to I'll get to Dominic quickly. I just think we could use more of that Franciscan passion of service to others. I'll give you an example of the lack of passion, because this is from last week. So there's a bishop, there's a priest I know in another diocese, metropolitan, who really was a good priest, hard worker, but he's turned 70, so now he's looking at retirement, right? But he lives in a large metropolitan, and this is true for me. If I was to retire, I couldn't afford rent in Coeur d'Alene. I couldn't afford rent in Boise unless I got into the retirement center. But I couldn't afford even rent here in Coeur d'Alene. And he lives in a major metropolitan. And so he's 70 years old. He was really a good priest. But at a priest meeting, he's talking with the bishop, and he says, well, Bishop, our retirement center, you still have to pay, but it's a reduced rent. He says, our retirement center only has 6 spots. And I'm about to retire. I can't afford rent anywhere in this city. What am I supposed to do? Now, you have to understand, the bishop lives in a gated community in a McMansion. And so the bishop says to him, when he says, what are you supposed to do? He says, get a friend. Well, really? It didn't occur to him, turn the bishop's mansion into a retirement center. Does that make sense? But anyhow, I'm talking about passion. Once again, maybe we need a little Franciscan spirituality in the church. It's passion that converts people, not pomp and circumstance. Wouldn't it be great if we were all like Francis or like Bruno, who I'm happy in my poverty. Now, real quick with Dominic. Dominic's a lot like Francis, a little bit different. A mendicant, a beggar order. But Francis didn't want his monks to be educated. He wanted them to be passionate and serve. Dominic, remember, priests stopped preaching. I know, bizarre. So Dominic, when he sees these Albigensians, he said, but maybe people would be moved if we took the gospel serious. So Dominic also takes up the way of poverty, but education as well. So Dominicans are OP, Order of Preachers, because priests stopped preaching. It's the Dominicans that showed the way of poverty and study and preaching. Does that make any sense? So, okay, now I just want to end with 5 minutes of questions so we don't go over an hour. Questions, objections? Right, yeah, Leonard. Yes. It's called a tonsure. And a tonsure is, it sounds kind of strange, it's a sign of obedience. Now, I can't explain how, but in the Bible, in the Old Testament, a sign of obedience was actually a pierced ear. So you hear the psalm, Lord, pierce my ear. Make me obedient. The word obedient means to listen. So in the Old Testament, it was a pierced ear. Somehow, in the Middle Ages, tonsure, to shave the top of your head, is like a ring. I don't know what that has to do with the ear, but that's what it was. Does that make sense? The Celts, they shave the front of their head. The rest of Europe shave the back of their head. So I'm developing a little tonsure myself. But it means obedience, that you've taken a vow of obedience. Oh, yes. That's not possible. Chocolate hadn't come to the New World yet. No. Wow. I do have to say, that's also what I'm impressed with, my former parish and this parish. One of the things I really impressed that I liked about this parish is that we have such an active food bank, so many people. And I think it's always a bad sign when a church doesn't feed the poor. And you can say, well, that doesn't. No, there's plenty of parishes who do nothing for the poor. I shouldn't say plenty. There are some who offer nothing but service to themselves. So if there's not a love for the poor, I always think that's a sign of a very unhealthy spirituality. Okay, we've gone 1 hour, and don't forget that next week, Mary and Deacon Chris will be speaking about Ignatian spirituality. And we do have things to wipe down the table, so God bless and thank you.